Hey everybody, sorry for the delay. Life happens, and now I have a new refrigerator. So that was fun but unexpected. Came right on the heels of a roof repair. So yeah, my bank account doesn't want anything else weird to happen in this house for a little while. So cross your fingers for me. All right, so here we are for our historical interpretive book club, chapter 2. A couple of quick housekeeping things, and just so you know, my notes are in front of me and right over there today, so that's why my eyeballs will keep darting over there. So a few housekeeping notes. First of all, I am on Kusa, Kiowa, Yamasee, and probably a few other communities' land, original indigenous land, and here in my neighborhood. And I wanted to acknowledge the indigenous peoples who lived here. Okay. So I took a little Instagram poll some weeks back and asked whether y'all would be interested in me putting these videos on Coffee or on YouTube or both. I'll actually honestly probably end up doing both. If I can put them in one place, I can put them in two. No problem. So I did start up a YouTube channel. It has a really long and complicated URL, and I don't get to customize the URL until there are 100 subscribers. So I will remind you again at the end of this video that the URL is in my link tree, which is in my profile. So click on my Instagram profile, click on the link that you see there. It will open up a link tree page, and you will see a button for my new YouTube channel. So there you go. It exists. Hopefully this video and the one from chapter 1 will be on there shortly. I have to work this evening giving candlelight tours, so maybe not until sometime later this weekend. But they'll be there. Please subscribe, and then I'll be able to get a shorter, more reasonable URL. Thanks. Okay, so just to recap chapter 1, we had some great discussion in the comments sections from chapter 1 a couple of weeks ago. We had a lot of conversation about speaking the people's language as we interpret and making sure that we can relate to our audiences and our professional colleagues that way. And again, this is not only for professional historic interpreters. You don't have to do this as your job. It's just a great way to be able to relate to people and to get them as excited about the history that you are interpreting as you are. Also, facts are tools. So relating facts just as they are is great, but using facts as tools to tell your story or create something meaningful is even better. And we'll talk more about that today for chapter 2. And also remembering that we all bring our own worldview. I think in the past, cultural institutions have treated the visitor as an empty vessel and have assumed that the visitor is just ready to absorb passively everything that the authority of the cultural institution had to offer, and that's not quite the case. We'll talk more about that today as well. But just to remember that everybody who comes to a site or who participates in your interpretation or who listens to your presentation is coming with their own worldview, their own life experience, their own biases. We all come with baggage, right? And so we have to remember that no history is unbiased, no interpretation is unbiased, and no visitor is unbiased. We just have to do our best to relate to those things. And that's actually where Tilden picks up in chapter 2. And honestly, it's a pretty short chapter, and he still kind of is long-winded about it. And I suspect after having written my notes that I'm going to be a little long-winded about it too, which maybe shouldn't happen. But anyway, this entire chapter seems to revolve around identifying the visitor or the audience member or the listeners or the watchers' baggage, and then using that to relate your interpretation, relate the history that you're trying to share to that individual. So he starts out by saying, when the visitor arrives, we don't know their reason for coming. There are a multitude of reasons why a visitor or an audience member might show up at your site or for your interpretation or at your event. And it's less important about why. I mean, it might be interesting. You might say, oh, how did you hear about us? Or why are you here today? What's most interesting to you? You can certainly ask those direct questions. But Tilden suggests that the reason why a visitor comes to see our interpretation is less important than for the interpreter to identify, now that this audience member is here, what are they going to be the most interested in? What is their driving force? What are they going to learn the most about? What do they want to learn the most about? And to me, that means, what can I say then? How can I identify what's important to them? And what can I say that is going to resonate the most deeply and the most meaningfully with each visitor? Excuse me. So that gets to Tilden's point. The visitor's chief interest is that which speaks to their own life experience, their own worldview. Our interpretations are most effective when they take the visitor or the audience member's baggage into account as we create these meaningful experiences. So, how do we do that? Well, I was shocked to learn that way back in 1957, Tilden is already making the point that we have to speak with our audience, not at them. Now, if you work in historic sites, if you work in museums, or even if you've just been to one recently, chances are you know that cultural institutions still struggle with this. We talked about it in the comments section. It's a little gatekeepy, right? Diggers Lost in Town. Eric, he mentioned that word, gatekeeping. It's still a problem in cultural institutions. We are not gatekeepers of this knowledge, and we cannot be. And way back in 57, Tilden is saying, you're going to be more effective if you speak with someone rather than at them. And he's referencing just adult visitors, but I would argue that it doesn't matter who the visitor is. Even children would prefer to be spoken with than lectured to. It also helps with the self-identification of the visitor with the topic. If they feel like they're being included in the conversation and in the interpretation, then they will have an easier time self-identifying with the information that you're offering. And here's what I mean. He quotes C.E. Merriman from a book called The Making of Citizens. And Tilden writes, the underlying design is, of course, to set up a group of the living, the dead, and those who are yet unborn, a group of which the individual finds himself a part, and of which he is in fact glad to count himself a member. And by virtue of that fact, an individual of no mean importance in the world, right? We're all looking to belong. We all want to be part of a group, and we all want to be significant in our own ways. We don't have to be the most famous, most powerful, most influential individual in the world, but we want to feel like we belong to something and that we are meaningful parts of that. Merriman writes, all the great group victories he shares in, all the great men are his companions in the bonds of the group, all its sorrows are by construction his, all its hopes and dreams, realized and thwarted alike, are his. And again, we're seeing here that use of he, him, where today we would say they, them, right? This is the human, not the man. And thus, he becomes, although of a humble status, a great man, a member of a greater group, and his humble life is thus tinged with a glory it might not otherwise ever hope to achieve. He is lifted beyond and above himself into higher worlds, where he walks with all his great ancestors, one of an illustrious group, whose blood is in his veins, and whose domain and reputation he proudly bears. Now, it's really interesting. This is a really complex concept, actually, because we do all want to be a part of something, and it makes sense that we all want to know about our own historic pasts and our ancestors. The problematic part comes when the group who has been focused on is the only narrative that's been expressed. So if we want to talk about why people get disconcerted or upset when they come to the plantation home of a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and the majority of the interpretation they hear about is actually of the enslaved population there, it's because on some level, the individual who is upset by that feels an association with the group that were the enslavers. And so their own perceived notion of their lineage, perhaps, which is that my ancestors were founders of the nation, is called into question when the focus is not put on that ancestor's accomplishments, and rather that focus is put on that ancestor's bad behaviors. And it's difficult, I think, for a number of people, especially those who have previously been the majority represented in history, to take a look at the new narratives that are coming out and still feel non-threatened, which is nonsense. Nobody should feel threatened by a more complete story of their ancestors. That's a whole other topic. Maybe we'll talk about that sometime. I am getting off the course of chapter 2. I just wanted to say that it is very important. We all want to feel like we belong to something. And a lot of people get really sensitive, and that gets really difficult when they realize that that thing that they want to be a part of isn't as perfect as their sort of ingrained understanding of their ancestors actually is. So we can talk about that in the comments, or we can make that another video and a discussion for after this book club. It's not going away. That's a crux of a lot of matters in historical interpretation today. It's not going away, and I don't want to ignore it. So we'll come back to that either in the comments or in a future video. But the point that people want to belong still stands. And it's really important because that means that the underrepresented narratives, those ones that haven't been centered since time immemorial, since the beginning of cultural institutions, especially here in the United States, it's really important that we share those narratives because there are so many more people in the world than just the descendants of the founding fathers, right? The founding thinkers, the founders. There are so many more people with historical groups and historical associations who deserve to feel like they are a part of something too. Every single one of us does. So we need to bring those narratives forward. And people shouldn't feel threatened when they perceive that their own historical past is being given short shrift, because it isn't. All of our groups are enriched when whole narratives are presented. Okay, so Tilden is saying people don't want to be talked at, they want to be talked with. And the reason is because they want to feel like they're a part of something. Yes, of course. And we can't feel like we're a part of something if somebody is lecturing at us. We could, I suppose, but it's much, much harder. And then he goes into a little aside. It's sort of a little tangent about creating labels. He talks about museum interpreters. And in this case, he's talking about really traditional gallery space museums. And he talks about label creation. That's not what I'm talking about. Mostly I'm talking about in-person interpretation. So this is not something that the audience that I'm really trying to speak to is necessarily going to encounter. But I did just want to acknowledge it and say that creating labels as interpretation is especially difficult. You have to be really deft to be able to do this. And the examples that Tilden offers are pretty great if you find yourself needing to create an interpretation without actually getting to speak to someone or to offer an interpretive performance, to ask people to consider, what their modern version is of whatever's in the case. So he's got some pretty interesting exercises there for label making, but I'm going to go ahead and move on. The one point that he makes with labels, though, he reiterates later as well, and that's that connecting the visitor with the place where they are physically standing is a super effective tool. It is simple. It is effective. For example, this history, it didn't happen somewhere else. That great woolly mammoth or whatever he's talking about labeling didn't roam, some faraway land. It was here. It lived here on this spot where you are standing right now. And that is super effective because that brings the past into the present. It makes it not just right here, but right now. And that is deceptively simple and really, really effective. You can see it all the time. It's why historic sites from the American Revolution, for example, are so effective if you go to a site where a battle took place, right? Because it happened here. Valley Forge comes to mind just because it is a site of my study and my heart. It is incredible to be in that space and to excavate a musket ball that was unfired, that was just dropped. I will never forget. I excavated it, and a young boy was standing there, maybe 7 or 8 years old. And after documenting it in the excavation unit, I picked it up and I put it in his hand and I said, "Hold that for just a moment." And I said, "You are the first person to touch that musket ball since the soldier who dropped it over 240 years ago. That's how many generations back." And his face was just... I'd like to think that he will never forget that experience, that tangible experience of holding something. It's like the ghost of that Continental soldier may as well have reached out and put that bullet in his hand. And that is an effective interpretation to bring then into now using here. So, for what that's worth. Now, that being said, there is a caveat because the example that Tilden uses of putting a visitor or an audience member into the place of a historic personage is a little problematic. It's more than a little problematic today. It is certainly not best practices. In this case, Tilden talks about putting a modern individual into the daily life of a prehistoric indigenous person. And this can get really complicated really fast. Now, this isn't always effective. It's not really best practice today. If one wanted to do that, I would highly recommend consulting with current indigenous tribe members who live in your area today and ask them not only how would they go about asking the visitor to put themselves in the place of these indigenous ancestors, but also how can we incorporate the story of the fact that this indigenous community is still here, that they are a modern and thriving community, that they are involved in X, Y, or Z today in the community, and that they're still here. So, for example, I often interpret at Fort Toulouse in Alabama, and there's a Creek Native village there. For the most part, we interpret in third person, not in the first person. We talk about the Creek ancestors, how they would have lived, what they might have done, or eaten, or created, or farmed, or hunted. Sometimes it's effective then to say, do you think that you might like to taste this particular food, or that task would be something that you would be interested in doing in the historic community. But often these questions are asked by indigenous descendants of that very same Creek community. People who come and volunteer their time at the historic site on the weekends, but who also work in indigenous businesses in the town where Fort Toulouse is located, who still have modern ceremonial grounds that they go to, native church as one of my Creek friends once said to me. It's like Indian church, he said. And I understand the analogy anyway. But it's important that people understand that, for example, the dance that we are sharing with you is a predecessor to, or sometimes is exactly the same as, the dance that happens on the native ceremonial grounds that most of us will never be invited to and never see because that's not for us. And that's okay. It's really good for people to understand that both of these things exist. That just because one existed in the past doesn't mean that the other doesn't exist today. So it's really dicey to ask somebody to put themselves in the place of a historic personage. We never want to relegate Indigenous communities to the past, especially if there are modern, thriving communities still present today. Likewise, it is not even remotely best practices to put visitors in the place of oppressed peoples. So, or in the place of the oppressors. So, for example, if a school group comes to a plantation, it does not do to break the children up and to assign some of them to be masters and some of them to be enslaved. This would be your job and this would be your job. Absolutely not. Not okay. There are better ways to get modern people to relate to the stories of the past than to role play. It is never, never okay. Hopefully you have seen the press recently. There have been multiple instances of classes being invited to the plantation to literally go out in the fields and pick cotton, or to sing songs like the enslaved communities would have sung during their workday. No. Roleplay is not best practices. It's not. It's simply not. There are other ways that we can do this. And that's why I feel like costumed interpretation needs to be done well, every time, 100% of the time, and properly with the proper context, because costumed interpretation by professionals or volunteers is just this close to roleplay. We have to be so careful about what we're doing. It's a performance. And we need to be so careful and so clear and so explicit. And it is never okay to assign roles to visitors. It's not okay. I cannot say that enough. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to stop, but it's not okay. All right. There are other ways that we can get people to relate their own lives to the lives that we're presenting from history. One of them is that here and now tool. Another great way is the example that Tilden uses with the President Roosevelt birth telegram. He talks about how the museum that presents that could have simply said, this is the room that President Roosevelt was born in. That's true. That could have worked just fine. But instead, they took that fact, here it is, facts as tools. They took that fact and they created a story with it. One which is relatable, one which still has modern sensibilities, and they wrote a telegram about just arrived, a bouncing baby boy. So this example of how a fact could just be related, but they decided to use it in order to tell the story better, using this emotion of the arrival of a new child and having the opportunity or having the obligation to alert the extended family, that's something that a lot of folks today can still relate to. An incredibly effective, moving, emotional, meaningful way to create the experience using the fact. So that's a great example and a great way to practice, right? So if I've got a fact, what is a relatable story that I can create out of it? Still making sure that the fact is intact. Ultimately, people are kind of predisposed to make comparisons between the historic personages that they are learning about through your interpretation and their own lives. We don't have to directly do it for them by assigning role play or what have you. People generally see an interpretation and think, oh, what would I have done? Or would I have been able to figure that out? Or would I have been part of a community that did things that way? The one exception that I have found highly effective is during the events that include the American War for Independence. I occasionally field with British units, and we talk very much about, do you find yourself to be a law-abiding citizen? Do you believe that the government is there to protect the citizenry? And we ask a series of questions that make people think that they are ascribing to the patriot ideal. And we thank them very much for, in the end, we thank them very much for their loyalty to His Majesty King George III. I find here in this country a lot that people think that, oh, I definitely would have been a patriot. I would have been a rebel. I wouldn't have been a Tory. I would have fought against King George's tyranny. And the truth is, I think that we all want to think better of ourselves because we know how the story ends, when in fact, I think a lot of us would have been Tories. People sometimes have that reaction when they come to plantations. Oh, I never would have been an enslaver. And I like to think that. I do. I want to think that. And the question is, if you grew up in a society that ascribed to the enslavement of other humans and it made your life so very easy, are you sure? Are you sure that you would have given up your comforts to free another human? I'd like to think so. But in my opinion, it's a less loaded self-comparison when we talk about something like the American War for Independence. It's a lot easier to tell somebody that they probably would have been a Tory than a patriot and have them go away with a new thought process and a new way to think about just how radical the people who chose to fight for their version of liberty really were. They were really, really radical. I don't mean like a radical dude, although that's cool too. But seriously, they were really rebellious individuals, and I'm not sure that as many people would have had the stomach for it as think that they would have. So all that to say, people are going to make those comparisons on their own. We don't have to do it for them. Sometimes it's an effective teaching tool, but most of the time, I let that be. I try to create interpretations such that people ask those questions of themselves and I don't have to do it. Tilden goes on with another problematic example. He asks people to think about going to an indigenous site like the day after Thanksgiving and eating Thanksgiving meal there, foodways. The example falls flat, but the point about how indigenous foodways have found their way into American culture is good. That's something that we often talk about at the plantations as well. How African and African American derived foodways are now simply considered American or Southern foodways. And it's important that we talk about the origins of those things that we think are so American, because they are, but they come from some very specific cultures that have historically been underrepresented in the narrative. And so foodways are a great opportunity to bring forward those underrepresented narratives and center BIPOC people, center women instead of men, center religious minorities, talk about LGBTQIA issues, anything that's related to food, culture, music, art, all of these are great. It's not the only thing that comprises historically underrepresented narratives, but they are all excellent gateways to start opening up that wider world. So I do like the conversation around indigenous foodways becoming part of the larger American narrative, even though the example, again, of putting somebody into a role-playing situation falls flat. It's really not my thing. And then at the very end, he brings it back around. Tilden uses an example from a lecture by a fellow named Huxley, And it's mostly an example of methodology. He's talking about how Huxley uses his lecture as a conversation. It brings us back to the earlier point in the chapter that people want to be spoken with, not at. And his example of Huxley's lecture says, it gets a little flowery. He says, and now those people are entirely captivated. They're going to hang on Huxley's every word because he started his lecture this way. Well, okay, that might be a little hyperbolic, but the point stands. You're going to retain somebody's attention better if they feel like they are part of a conversation rather than a passive absorber of knowledge from the authority or from the gatekeeper. In short, conversation, relating to somebody as they bring their worldview, as they bring their baggage, is always going to create a more meaningful experience for a visitor or for an audience member than a lecture of I am the authority and you will sit and passively listen to me ever will. So, okay, it's a short chapter and yet somehow I've talked for half an hour. Main takeaways from this chapter. We speak with people, not at them, in order to be effective. We do our best to relate our historical information, our historical narratives, to the current life and worldview and experience of each audience member, each individual. In theory, they're receptive to this because they've showed up at our site or at our interpretive offering. We allow those visitors and audience members to make the comparison between themselves and that which they are learning about for themselves. We do not need to assign them roles in order for them to make those comparisons and have those considerations. It's best when we can use the facts as tools to spin a story to derive that emotion and that meaning. We want to appeal to visitors' emotions and create something meaningful for them. And we create those meaningful experiences best through conversation. Okay, so let me know what you think in the comments. Let's have another conversation. And for the next one, I want to look at chapters 3 and 4 together. They're both also short, but I think that the themes of the chapters really go together well. So for the next one, it might be even a little bit longer of a video, and that's okay because I think it's really important that we take a look at those two and their themes together. All right, don't forget, check out my link tree in my profile, new YouTube channel, go and subscribe. Check out the coffee. There's also a link for that. If you feel like it, you can catch these videos now in 3 places as soon as I get them uploaded. So, okay, everybody, I hope you've enjoyed chapter 2. Straightforward and yet complicated, just like all interpretation. Thanks very much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!